Hey everyone, today we're going to be doing a skill builder tutorial talking about edge coating. I was one of those people that didn't do edge coating. I didn't like it. I didn't want to learn how to do it, and I certainly didn't want to spend the money getting everything that I needed to get a good result. However, I did a tutorial for a pattern that really needed edge coating, and after that, I was an edge coating convert. So I'm going to talk to you about what I use to get what I think is a good result. I'm going to be demonstrating doing the edge painting on this mini purse pattern, which is one that I have coming out soon. So you can see here, this is 3 layers at the edge, 2 layers here at the top, and you really can't see any joins between those layers. It gives a nice uniform look. It's not tacky at all. It's nice and smooth. And it really gives a professional look to your finished products. So I'm going to show you how to achieve that, the tools that I use, and give you any of my little tips along the way that I have found have helped me get my edge painting to a place that I am happy with. So why do you edge paint? You edge paint when you have a raw edge project. So there's several patterns out there that are raw edge projects, anything where you have 2 layers of a non-fray fabric, so those are your vinyls, corks, faux leathers, and they come together and you have a visible line where your layers meet. They may be sewn together, they may be glued together, but the edge of your project, you can see the layers where they meet. If you're confident in your edge painting skills, you can create a uniform edge around there that won't show all of those seams, and it really can give you a really great end result. So let's get going. The things that you will need to get started with edge painting are a way to prepare the edges of your project. So you can use a lighter to melt down any of the fuzzies on your material, or you can use a burnishing gum. I prefer to use the lighter. I have tried to use the gum, and I find that on the synthetic materials like vinyl, it just doesn't work as well as it probably would on a leather. So I prefer to use a lighter, but that is certainly an option. You will need a base coat. When I first started doing edge painting, I was just using the straight up color without a base coat underneath, and it just gets sucked right into those fibers on the back of your vinyl. And that was something that I had no idea why I wasn't getting that nice, smooth, rubbery looking rounded edge. That's because I was not using a base coat. So you will need a base coat, and then you will need something to actually color your edges with. You can just use a neutral color on the edges. You don't have to go with an actual color, but you will need something on top of the base coat itself. You'll need something to apply these different liquids with. You can use a wooden skewer. You can use one of these roly things, and I also have one of these bowls, which is super handy. And then you will need something to smooth down your layers in between coats. So you can use a fine grit nail file or some fine grit sandpaper. I have a few different colors. I have black, white, brown, and then the primary colors so that I can mix and match to get whatever I want. But when I started, I just had black. Edge coating is something that does take time. You have to allow each layer to dry properly in between, and I highly recommend sanding it down in between your layers so that you get a really nice, smooth finish. To get the good result, I really think it is something that you have to say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do my edge coating, and then I'm going to go off and do something else and come back to it each time you need to do another layer. Depending on the part of your bag that you're edge coating, you're going to apply the edge coat either before you start sewing or after you start sewing. So if you have a project, for example, that has this zipper window, I have edge coated the inside here prior to sewing this penny purse together. So I've edge coated around the zipper rectangle and the upper edge of this slip pocket. But the outside edge of this, I have edge coated after I have sewn it all together. So you want to consider what you're edge coating, which parts of your material will have a raw edge exposed, and decide if you want to go ahead and edge coat those before you sew or wait and edge coat it at the end. The first thing that we're going to need to do is make sure that the edges of our project are lined up. When you are doing a raw edge project, you may find that sometimes the layers of your vinyl do not quite line up, so you'll need to trim them to make sure that they are as flush as possible before starting your edge painting. I like to use a pretty sharp pair of scissors And then you can just trim any little excess bits so that they line up nice and neatly. For straight edges, you can also use a ruler and your rotary cutter. When you're happy that you've got those nice and squared up, you're going to need to remove the fuzziness of your vinyl. Different vinyls have different backings, and some are going to leave more of a fuzzy edge than others. I like to use a lighter just around the edges, just to melt down any of those fuzzy bits. Because these are synthetic backings, not cotton backings, it will just melt down. The other option, especially if you happen to have a backing that is not synthetic, is to use a burnishing gum that you just smooth on, and it will slick down those little fluffy bits. Once you're happy with that, you're ready to apply your first layer of your base coat. For my base coat, I like to use this Giardini Max Matte Base Coat Dense, but there are a few different options that you can get out there, so you can have a look and experiment with what you like. You can apply it using a wooden skewer, or you can use one of these rollers. I'm going to show you both. When I'm doing my first layer of base coat, my goal is to fill in any gaps or inconsistencies. So on this one, for example, there's a little divot between the layers here, which is my third layer in the middle. So I'm going to use the base coat just to fill that in so that I will still be able to get that nice rounded edge. The roller is good when it's already even and you just want to be able to go around nice and quickly. So the first time I go around, I'm going to use the wooden skewer. Just dip it in. I try not to wipe it on the edge of the bottle because it does set on the side there and it can be quite wasteful. I take my base coat and I just put the drop right in the middle, and then I just spread it along using the point of that wooden skewer. The first layer of your base coat is also sealing the edge there so that it won't suck in your paint. So when you go around the first time, you may find that it sucks in a little, and that's okay. That's just sealing those fibers, and then we will go around with our additional coats. You can see here, this is what I'm talking about with it sucking in between the layers, but that's fine. We're going to be able to get that all evened out as we add more and more layers to our edge. When you're happy with that first coat of your base coat, we're going to leave that to dry. You're going to want it to dry quite well because we're going to be sanding that back. You can lay it flat on a surface. Sometimes I just use something like a little container and just lay it on the surface like that so that it can dry. That's why you don't do a coat that is too thick so that you don't get any drips. But the other option is to grab something like these bulldog clips, and you can just clip them on your project, and then you can stand it up like that so that it will dry nice and evenly and not rub off on your surface. So we're going to let that dry, and then we'll come back to sand that coat. That first coat of my base coat has been drying for about an hour now. Before we do the second layer of our base coat, we do need to sand around the edge of where we applied the first coat so that we have as smooth of a surface as possible before we apply the second coat. For the base coat, I like to use one of these emery boards to sand. This is a 180-240 grit emery board, and I use the 180 side for any bigger bumps and then the 240 side for where it is not quite as uneven, just to smooth that out and get rid of any bubbles or any other kind of uneven parts around the edge. So go ahead and sand that, gently taking care not to scratch your vinyl, and then we'll be ready to apply the second layer of the base coat. When you're doing your first sanding of that initial base coat, you don't need to be too worried if there's some parts where you are sanding or filing that base coat down to a very minimal level, because we're going to be adding a second coat, and you just want to make sure that you've got a nice smooth surface. focus on any areas where there's been accumulation of your base coat, any bumps that are there, and just sand those down nice and smoothly. Now I'm going to apply my second coat. Take a look at your edge and see any places that you have missed or any places that the base coat is sucking into your gaps. And you're going to focus on filling those in and then putting a second coat over the entire edge also. I'm going to switch now to my roller tool. Just dip the tip in, shake off the excess, and then let it run down the side. It rolls more easily from the bottom. You can just run that around the edge to get a nice even coat. Smooth out any bits that are obviously sitting there with a big drip, and then set that aside to dry. Make sure between your coats of your base coat or your paint, you are rinsing off your tools, as the rubbery base coat will stick to your roller or your skewer, and that will make it much harder to work with when you come back to do your next layer. After that second coat has had a chance to dry, you're just going to sand it again, the same as we did after the first coat, smoothing it out. And then we're going to have a look and see if we need to do a third coat of our base coat. Sometimes when you have some more areas that are uneven than you might like, you will need to do a third layer of your base coat. And other times, 2 layers of base coat will be sufficient to get you a nice smooth surface for applying your edge paint. Because we had some of those areas that it was fairly deep when we were putting that second coat of edge paint in, I am going to do a third layer of the edge coat on this one. But for comparison, here is another penny purse that I've made that just has 2 layers of edge coat, and that one is ready to be painted, even though that one just has the 2 layers. So it really depends on the project. If you were just doing 2 layers of vinyl, then 2 coats of your edge paint will often be enough. If you're doing 3 layers, you are at a greater risk of having an uneven edge still after that second coat of your base coat. So you may want to just add the third one just to keep it nice and even. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that third coat now. And because most of those areas are nicely filled in, I'm just going to use the roller rather than the skewer to do it. So I should be able to get it on fairly quickly. And it will just be a thin layer that I will leave to dry once more before we'll be ready to apply our color. And when you're happy with that, set that aside to dry once again. Once that final layer of your base coat has dried, once again, you're going to sand down any bumps to make a nice smooth surface so that you can start applying your edge paint. Because we have created a fairly nice, even, smooth surface for applying our edge paint by putting on the multiple base coats and sanding between the layers, I am going to use this roller to just quickly apply that edge paint. I do not recommend putting anything around the edge here to stop any drips, as I like to see as I'm going if anything is dripping down onto the exterior of my product. You can use a baby wipe. You can get a Q-tip that's just got water on it. Some people like to use isopropyl alcohol. Definitely patch test your vinyl before doing any of that to make sure that it's not going to remove any of the finish on your vinyl itself. I tend to just use my thumb and just wipe it off as I go, and then I wash it off my hands, but everyone is different in how they choose to do that. So we're going to apply the first coat, and then we're going to let that one dry, and then we will apply a second coat if it is necessary. Just dip the tip in. You don't want to dip it in too far. The same as we did when we used this tool for the base coat. I like to tap it down as it rolls better from the fatter part of the roller. And we're just going to go around. I prefer to do a thin layer and then add additional layers if necessary, especially when I'm working with a slightly thicker project, anything thicker than just 2 layers. Do your best to get a nice even coverage, smooth out any blobs. And if you just have little bits to touch up, you can just use the tip of the roller, or if you're using your wooden skewer, that's a great way to touch up the little bits. And if there are any drips, I recommend removing them before they dry. I'm going to set that aside to dry, and again, I recommend rinsing your tool between your layers, even if you're going to be coming back as soon as it's dry. Definitely want to rinse that off. The tip of your wooden skewer also is a really good way to get the paint out of the grooves. Something else that I want to show you is this handy little tool here. This is a little metal dish that has a rollable that is similar to the rollable on this tool here. And the way that it works is you just slide your piece straight along there and it will very evenly and quickly coat the edge. I like to tuck these more dangly zippers inside and slide that up so that that doesn't get in the way. And then all you're going to do is just roll your piece straight along that ball. You just pour a little bit of your edge paint in, not too much, as it will build up at the edge of that roller. You just roll it along that little wheel. Check to see where you need a little more coverage. This is a really great tool for doing the outside of things you're going to be edge coating. It doesn't work for the insides if you're edge coating the inside of a zipper overlay or the inside of a zipper opening. It also doesn't work if you have anything that is kind of a concave type shape, but anything that is convex shape and more than one layer. A single layer also is kind of tricky. It's a little too flimsy to be supported when you're rolling it. But this is just 2 layers. And it's a nice rounded shape, and it's a really quick way to get a really even coat of edge paint around the edge very easily. It's especially good if you find that you don't have as steady of a hand as you might like to edge coat using the roller or a wooden skewer. It's certainly not a necessary purchase. Definitely a handy purchase. I have also used this for applying the base coat. It takes several layers and it doesn't get into the little gaps to even it out as well as you can with your skewer. So it's not my first choice for that, but if you've got a pretty even surface that you're starting with, you definitely can do it. You just might need to do a few more coats, and you don't want to leave your paint in here. It'll dry out, so you just have to be mindful so that you don't waste your product. So as you can see, that's on really nice and evenly, and I'm going to let that one dry too, and then we'll come back to do the second coat if it's necessary. While that's drying, I'll just demonstrate an example of when I would choose to use the skewer for my edge painting, and that is this kind of circumstance where you're working inside of a shape. So I have not put any base coat on this. I am just going to do the little bit of edge coat. You could do base coat as well. When it's the inside of a zipper opening like this, I often just do a little bit of the paint, often just one coat, so it's just there to disguise the backing. I did use my lighter to singe down the fuzziness, but I'm just going to go around the edge there. And I like to work from the back. And if I angle the skewer, then anything that would go over the edge is going to be on the inside, not on the outside. You just have a lot more control for that single layer using the skewer as opposed to using the roller. You can get right into the corners when you have tight little spots. You can do a little rolling motion too, or you can just drag that skewer across. And then I would just set that aside to dry, the same as we did with the other pieces. This kind of container works really well. I just rest it on the top and then nothing is touching, but I have my opening able to dry and it's well supported all around. Once the first coat of paint is dry, take a look at it and decide if you think that your project needs a second coat of paint. For this one, I think that this is going to be just fine with one coat of paint, so I will consider this one to be finished. This one, I think, needs a second coat. Before I apply that second coat, I'm just going to take this very fine grit sandpaper. This is 1500 grit, and I'm just going to gently sand that first layer of paint, just to make sure that it's nice and smooth, that there's no bumps from where bubbles have burst. The surface should be pretty even because we've done our base coat and we've sanded it down between those coats. And then once I've sanded that, I'm going to apply the second coat of paint, making sure to cover any spots where I've missed or where you can still see the very edge of the vinyl. So a good place to check is just around the very edges here to make sure that you have covered the entire surface of your edge. And when you're happy with that, let that dry, and then you will be finished. Once that final layer of paint has had a chance to dry, take a look at your edges and determine if you need to add a top coat. I don't add a top coat to the edge coat edge paint because the finish is glossy enough for me as it is, and it doesn't have a tacky finish, but some brands you will want to put a top coat on. So you would put that top coat directly over the top, apply the same way as we did with the other layers, let it dry, and then you will be all finished. And you can stand back and admire all of your hard work and your beautiful finished edges. Hope that helps. Thanks, everyone.